Chapter 33 of Lotus Buds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Katie Grace. Lotus Buds by Amy Wilson CARMICHAEL. Chapter 33. Chapter 33. If This Were All. An hour earlier, 3 of us had stood together by the pool at the foot of the falls and watched the people bathe. At the edge of the rock, an old grandmother had dealt valiantly with an indignant baby of 2, whom despite its struggles she bathed after prolonged preparation of divers anointings by holding it grimly, kicking and slippery though it was, under what must have seemed to it a terrible hurrying horror. When at last that baby emerged, it was too crushed in spirit to cry. Beyond this little domestic scene was a group of half-reluctant women, longing and yet fearing to venture under the plunging waters, and beyond them again were the bathers, crowding but never jostling each other on the narrow ledge upon and over which the falls descend. Some were standing upright with bowed heads under the strong chastisement of the nearer, heavier fall, some bent under it, as if overwhelmed with the thundering thud of its waters. Some were further on, where the white furies lash like living whips, and scourge and sting and scurry, and there the pilgrims were hardly visible, for the waters swept over them like a veil, and they looked in their weirdness and muteness like martyr ghosts. Further still, some were carefully climbing the steps cut into the cliff, or standing as high as they could go upon an unguarded projection of rock, with eyes shut and folded hands, entirely oblivious apparently to the fact that showers of spray enveloped them, and the deep pool lay below. I had never seen anything quite like this. It was a strange commingling of the beautiful and sorrowful. The women, fair-skinned Brahmin women they chanced to be, were in their usual graceful raiment of silk or cotton, all shades of soft reds, crimson, purple, blue, lightened with yellow and orange, which in the water looked like dull fire. Their golden and silver jewels gleamed in the sunlight, and their long black hair hung round faces like the faces one sees in pictures. The men wore their ordinary white, and the ascetics the salmon-tinted saffron of their profession. Then, as if to add an ethereal touch to it all, a rainbow spanned the falls at that moment, and we saw the pilgrims through it or arched by it as they stood, some at either end of the bow where the colors painted the rock and the spray, and some in the space between. The sun struck the forest hanging on the steeps above, and it became a vivid thing in quick delight of greenness. It was something which, once seen, could hardly be forgotten. The triumphant stream of white set deep in the heart of a great horseshoe of rock and woods, the delicate, exquisite pleasure of color, and the people in their unself-consciousness, bathing and worshipping just as they wished, with background, rock and spray, and for a halo, rainbow. To one who looked with sympathy, the picture was a parable. You could not but see visions. You could not but dream dreams. Then from the quiet heights crept a colony of monkeys, their chatter drowned in the roar of the falls. On they came, wise and quaint, like the half-heard whispers of old-time jokes, and they bathed in the mimic pools above, as it seemed in imitation of the pilgrims, holding comical little heads under the light trickles. And below, the scene changed as a company of widows came and entered the falls. They were all Brahmins and all old, and they shivered in their poor scanty garments of coarse white. Most of them were frail with long fasting and penance, and they prayed as they stood in the water or crouched under its weight. Such a one had sat on the stone under the special fall, which, as the friend who had taken me observed with more forcefulness than sentiment, comes down like a sack of potatoes. I had tried to stand it for a minute, but it pelted and pounded me so that less than a minute was enough, and I moved to make room for a Brahmin widow who was bathing with me, and then she sat down on the stone, and the waters beat very heavily on the old gray head. But she sat on in her patience, her hands covering her face, and she prayed without one moment's intermission. How little she knew of the other prayer that rose beside hers through the rushing water. It was the first time I, at least, had ever prayed in a waterfall. "O send forth thy light and thy truth, let them lead her." She struggled up at last and caught my hand. Then, steadying herself with an effort, she felt for the iron rod that protects the ledge, and blinded by the driving spray and benumbed by the beat of the water, she stumbled slowly out. But the wistful face had a look of content upon it, and her only concern was to finish the ceremonial out in the sunshine. She had brought her little offerings of a few flowers with her, and so, much as I longed to follow her and tell her of the cleansing of which this was only a type, it could not have been then. Oh, the rest it is at such a time to remember that the Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies are over all his works. Below the pool, in the broad bed of the stream and on its banks, all was animation and happy, simple life. Here the women were drying their garments, without taking them off, in a clever fashion of their own. There some were washing them in the stream. Children played about as they willed. But in and among the throng, anywhere, everywhere, we saw worshippers, standing or sitting facing the east, alone or in company, chanting names for the deity, or adoring and meditating in silence. Doubtless some were formal enough, but some were certainly sincere, and we felt if this were all there is to know in Hinduism, the time must soon come when a people so prepared would recognize in the Savior and lover of their souls him for whom they had been seeking so long, if haply they might feel after him and find him. But this is not all there is to know. Back out of sight, behind the simple joyousness of life, to which the wholesome waters and the sparkling air and the beauty everywhere so graciously ministered, behind that wonderful wealth of thought as revealed in the higher Hinduism, which is born surely of nothing less than a longing after God, behind all this what do we find? Glory of mountain and waterfall, charm and delight of rainbow and spray. But what lies behind the colored veil? What symbols are carved into the cliff? Whose name and power do they represent? This book touches one of the hidden things. Would that we could forget it. Sometimes through these days, as we sat on the rocks by the waterside, in the unobtrusive fashion of the Indian religious teacher, who makes no noise but waits for those who care to come, we have almost forgotten, in the happiness of human touch with the people, the lovable women and children more especially, that anything dark and wicked and sad lay so very near. And then, suddenly, as we have told, we have been reminded of it. We may not forget it if we would. It is true that the thing we mean is disowned by the spiritual few, but to the multitude it is part of their religion. Of course temple women must adopt young children, and they must be carefully trained, or they will not be meet for the service of the gods. So said the Brahmin, who only a moment before had led me into the mystic land, deep within which he loves to dwell. What does the training mean? A fortnight ago, the friend to whom the child is dear took me to see the little girl described in a letter from an Indian sister as a little dove in a cage. I did not find that she minded her cage. The bars have been gilded. The golden glitter has dazzled the child. She thinks her cage a pretty place, and she does not beat against its bars as she did in the earlier days of her captivity. As we talked with her, we understood the change. When first she was taken from school, the woman to whose training her mother has committed her gave her polluting poetry to read and learn, and she shrank from it, and would slip her Bible over the open page and read it instead. But gradually the poetry seemed less impossible. The atmosphere in which those vile stories grew and flourished was all about her. As she breathed it day by day, she became accustomed to it. The sense of being stifled passed. The process of mental acclimatization is not yet completed. The lovely little face is still pure and strangely innocent in its expression, but there is a change, and it breaks the heart of the friend who loves her to see it. I must learn my poetry. They will be angry if I do not learn it. What can I do? And again, oh, the stories do not mean anything, said with a downward glance, as if the child conscience still protested. But this was a fortnight ago. It is worse with that little girl today. There is less inward revolt, and tomorrow, how will it be with her? End of chapter 33.